Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder three? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Trike. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite Number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. It's that time of year again, my favorite season. Halloween is coming, and all the good shows are on TV. Here are a few scary stories to get you in the mood for October 31st. These stories are true as far as I could find out. Some had no dates or names attached to them, so I don't know who or when they happened. No way to find out. Like this first story, I read it on several websites, but none had any history mentioned. I hate telling about an event and saying the person who saw it or the storyteller says. After a few different tales with the same lack of names, it gets redundant. So I gave each person a name. When I write a book, I ask my sources if they want their names mentioned. If they say they don't mind, I'll write their name out and give them full credit for the story. If, on the other hand, they say they don't want their name in black and white, they want to remain anonymous, I'll assign them a name so that the reader has somebody to think about. The names might not be real, but the stories are true as far as I know. When this witness was young, let's call her Liz, she lived in an old house by the woods. She could see a cemetery from her back porch. Nice, quiet neighbors, hopefully. Liz and her younger sister shared a room with bunk beds in one corner. One Easter, she remembers waking up and seeing the Easter Bunny in her room. It felt like a dream, so she didn't scream or try running. The bunny looked more like somebody in a creepy-looking costume. As Liz lay there watching this intruder, she smelled what reminded her of wet hay. Feeling confused and disoriented, the young girl drifted back to sleep, thinking it was all just a bad dream. When she woke up for real this time, Liz didn't bother to tell anybody about what she'd seen since it was just a dream. Nothing to worry about or mention to anyone. The family did the Easter egg hunt, and her sister found all the eggs hidden around their home. Liz said that she did find an unusual-looking Easter egg that her parents said they didn't hide, or at least they didn't remember hiding it. It looked a bit odd, but hey, it was just an egg, so there was still no reason to think more about it. Years later, when Liz was in high school, she asked her parents if they had ever dressed up like the Easter Bunny in order to sneak around the house hiding eggs all over the place. They both said they would never go through so much trouble just to hide eggs. It wasn't the kind of thing most folks would do. As Liz was asking about the Easter Bunny mystery, her younger sister, who had slept in the upper bunk back when these weird experiences had happened, said she remembered when the Easter Bunny came into their room in the middle of the night. It was dark, and the younger sister assumed it was one of their parents dressed up. She remembers watching this giant rabbit move about the dark room. Then, she said, she also remembered how the room had smelled of wet hay. To say this was a shock is an understatement. Liz told one of her friends during lunch at school about how she'd seen a creepy Easter bunny and her sister had seen it as well. The friend lived right across the street from Liz and her family. The friend said late one night around Easter time, years ago, she'd looked out the front window of her home and saw someone dressed like the Easter bunny standing in the driveway. To this day, Liz is afraid of anyone dressed up like a rabbit. This brings to mind stories about the Bunnyman of Fairfax Station Bridge in northern Virginia. Since 1904, when an asylum inmate escaped, folks have reported seeing some guy dressed up in a bunny costume hanging out around the train bridge. He is known to attack people with an axe. As I was finishing up my research for this show, I was watching Beyond the Unknown, and what were they talking about? They had Lorne Coleman talking about the Bunnyman. I don't like coincidences. They're just a little too weird. I believe this next story comes from the UK. The wording sounded very British to me. I'll call the guy Hank just because. He didn't give his name on any of the websites that I read. Try imagining a British guy called Hank. While he was in university, that's how they speak in England, we would say we were at the university. While he was in university, Hank was fond of looking for snakes. He was a biology student with an interest in herpetology. I like snakes. I like seeing them in the wild. I don't mess with them. I can tell the difference between a poisonous snake and a non-poisonous snake. I still don't mess around with them. Anything that can move around without arms or legs is doing a great job without my help. Well, a friend from the herpetology club showed Hank this room that he would visit on a lot of occasions looking for snakes. The two got together, and they would drive slowly down this old back road in the dark, looking for snakes that had slithered onto the warmer road to heat up. Snakes are cold-blooded, which means they don't generate their own body heat, so they rely on outside sources to warm up. The road these two had taken was about 4 miles long. It only had 4 houses on its entire length, and it was a dead end. They'd made a few laps up and down the road, and they were making their last pass for the evening. There were 2 houses located near the very beginning of the road, one at about the midpoint, and the last one was at the far end where it dead-ended. They're getting close to the house at midpoint when they thought they saw movement in the thick brush on the left side of the road. There were quite a few animals on this road, so they didn't think this was anything but maybe a big dog or somebody's cow had gotten out of its pasture. Glancing at the spot where they thought they'd seen movement, the pair saw a young boy come running from the trees. He looked to be about 8 or 9 years old. He was dressed in a ratty t-shirt and torn blue jeans. The boy gave the 2 men one quick look. His face was a mixture of fear and pain. He quickly looked back over his shoulder, back the direction he had come from. This was followed by the boy dashing across the road and into the trees on the other side of the road. The guy with Hank got out of the car immediately and ran to where the boy had vanished, trying to see if he was okay. Hank got busy parking the car and jumped out to join his partner when his friend came running back out from the trees, come running back to the car as fast as he could go. "Get out of here now!" he yelled. The fear in his voice was enough to get Hank to jump back into the driver's seat and hit the gas. They threw dirt in the air as they sped away from the area. Hank wanted to know what they were running from, so he asked. His friend finally calmed down enough to say, when he had stepped into the trees, he found himself standing in a small cemetery with just 5 grave markers. With his flashlight, his friend had seen all the grave markers had the same last name and the same date of death. One of the grave markers had the ages of a 9-year-old boy on it. This revelation put an end to their late-night visits to that particular road. The next year, Hank decided to drive to that road once more, this time accompanied by his girlfriend. This trip was a lot earlier than the last one. As they drove along the road, Hank spotted 3 men doing some yard work in the front yard of the middle house. He stopped next to the men and he asked about the graveyard in the woods. One of the men said his uncle's family used to have a house across the road from him. Late one night, a space heater had caught fire, and the entire house had burned down before the fire department could arrive. The entire family was found dead, except for the youngest boy. The 9-year-old was never found, but the authorities assumed he had died in the fire and his body had just been so badly burned they could never find it. Hank was hesitant to mention what he and his friend had seen, but eventually he got around to telling what he had seen. All 3 men froze, and they looked back and forth amongst themselves. Finally, one said that each and every one of them had seen this same boy run from the trees and enter the woods near the cemetery. This had happened on many occasions. They had all gone looking at one time or another, but they could find only the graves. All of these men think this is the ghost of their missing cousin. Hank refuses to go near that road ever again. Once more, the teller of this story didn't give a name. Some folks are afraid of the backlash from people hearing about a strange encounter, and so they don't want their names mentioned. I don't have that problem. I found once I stopped caring about other people's opinions, I was much happier. I'm going to call this next guy Jim. Jim grew up in a small town, and he lived out in the country. He was 17 at the time, and he'd just gotten his learner's permit for driving. Jim and his mother had gone to the local Walmart late one night, and he was using the trip to practice his driving while out and about. On the return drive, Tom wanted to take a back road home to avoid the traffic and get a little faster driving in. Some of these back roads can be kind of creepy to some. Late-night driving can be quite an adventure. Tom was driving along, well under the posted speed limit, since he was feeling just a bit uneasy about the roadway ahead. From out of the darkness, a woman suddenly jumped in front of the car. Tom slammed on the brakes, praying he wouldn't hit her. The woman was screaming and pounding on the hood of the car. He could see her mouth moving, but he couldn't hear anything coming out. The woman was very dynamic and moving around, hitting the hood, but this wasn't making any sounds either. Well, Tom's mother was freaking out and yelled at him to get going. The woman was now standing on the side of the car, so Tom gave it just enough gas to slip by the woman and then speed up once she was behind them. Tom and his mother both looked back, but the woman had disappeared. It was like she'd never been there. Once home, Tom looked at his car, but he could find no marks of anyone having beat on the hood. Looking for answers, he discovered there is a legend of a woman that haunts the road near a bridge. She is said to have died nearby and is seen by people driving the road late at night. The witness of this story didn't give a location, so I can't tell you where to go if you want to encounter this woman. She's out there somewhere. I came up with Debbie as this next name. She lived in what she referred to as a house from hell for 6 years, from age 11 to 16. There was constantly something happening. Doors flying open and shut, voices coming from the empty rooms, footsteps that couldn't be attached to any person. Nothing ever stayed where she put it. Debbie was alone there a lot because both her parents worked, and she was constantly in a state of terror. One of her least favorite things was seeing the little girl that was almost always in the bathroom. This girl had curly blonde hair, and she was wearing a rose-colored dress. The first time Debbie saw this girl, she thought someone had somehow snuck into her home. It took a while to figure out this girl was a ghost. The ghost looked as if it had come from the early 1900s. When Debbie tried talking to the ghost, she got no reaction. Debbie kept the door closed to the bathroom any time she was home alone. She didn't want to see the ghost. It scared her quite a bit. If Debbie did have to enter the bathroom, she would step around the little girl, trying to ignore her. I know this might sound odd, but try thinking like an 11-year-old. The ghost wasn't there all the time. It would show up once in a while, but it did pop in for a visit. It always stood in the corner by the door. Debbie felt sorry for the ghost, thinking it was trapped there in the corner of the bathroom forever. On a few occasions, Debbie worried she might be losing her mind. As the years went by, Debbie noticed the ghost seemed to feel a lot darker, more hostile. It still stood in the corner of the bathroom, but it felt as if this was not really a little girl, but something else. Something projecting the image of a girl. One day, when she was about 14, Debbie had a friend coming from out of town who was going to stay with her for a week. She didn't mention the ghost in the bathroom, not wanting her friend to think she was nuts. Maybe Debbie was the only person who could see this entity. Maybe it was all in Debbie's mind. Maybe she was going nuts. Debbie and her friend were sitting in her bedroom when her friend said she needed the bathroom. Debbie waited to see what her friend was going to say. Her friend came back into the bedroom with an odd look on her face. "You do know there's a little girl in your bathroom, right?" her friend asked. "Yes, she's there just about all the time." Her friend then dropped the bomb. "You know she's not really a little girl, right?" Well, this made Debbie feel kind of sick. She had suspected this for years, but having somebody else say it made it all too real. For the remainder of her visit, her friend wouldn't use the hall bathroom. Debbie began avoiding it as well, opting to go downstairs instead. Debbie still refused to mention the thing in the bathroom to her folks. When she was 15, the family moved to a new place. Her folks still owned the other house. They were having difficulty selling it. They never did say why they couldn't sell it, just that nobody else wanted to buy it. When Debbie was finally 18, she had to go back to the house. Her boyfriend, let's call him Carl, went along to help gather up the things from the house. As they drove onto the property, her friend became white as a sheet. He was very uncomfortable and getting worse as they got closer to the house. Well, he insisted that he was okay to help out, not wanting to look weak. They entered the whole house and got busy grabbing her things from Debbie's old room. Carl felt the call of nature, so he asked to be excused, and he went to the hall bathroom. Debbie waited, wondering if the ghost would still be there. Carl came running back into the room. He was out of breath. Once he'd calmed down just a bit, he said he saw the little girl in the bathroom, and, well, it wasn't really a girl, but something else. He told Debbie, "The thing in the bathroom is mad at you." Debbie was not supposed to have ever been able to leave. The two grabbed what they could carry in one quick trip and fled the house. Her parents eventually were able to sell the house. Nobody has reported seeing the thing in the bathroom as far as we know, but like I said, I don't have an address or a location, so we may never know if the little girl is still haunting the bathroom or not. I've mentioned how I don't trust any kind of a ghost child. There's no reason for a child's spirit to linger on after death. To me, a ghost of any kid is probably something else trying to deceive people into thinking it's just a poor, harmless entity, right up until it has you. Jill and her fiancé Joe, once again I had to assign names, were renting a house. One morning they had slept in. It was about 10:30 and the pair was contemplating just spending the rest of the day in bed. Jill was laying on her side with her back to the door, and Bob was laying on his back. They were talking about how maybe they ought to get up since it was going to be time to go to work soon. Jill suddenly felt as if the air had all left the room. The atmosphere became very heavy. She also had a feeling of tipping sideways even though she was laying in bed. She felt her ears pop like she was going up high in an airplane. Jill was going to try ignoring these weird feelings, hoping they would go away, when Joe said he was having a difficult time breathing. His voice sounded odd, as if he was struggling for air. Jill asked him if he was feeling the same thing she was, and he said yes. She noticed her own voice sounded slurred, as if it weren't hers. She was going to roll onto her back when she discovered she couldn't move. When she mentioned this to her boyfriend, he said he could not move either. He tried to lift his arms, but they felt way too heavy. The pair was beginning to get very nervous, thinking there was some kind of a gas leak or some other substance that might be toxic. Something may be coming into the room that might be lethal. A sound came to them. It was the doorknob turning. The knob sounded like it was being turned back and forth, like someone or something was trying to open the door. The door to the bedroom wasn't locked, so if somebody was trying to open it, they should have just pushed it inward. Had they been able to move, they were both too scared to do so. Jill managed to tip her head just enough to get a sight of the door. The knob was turning back and forth. Joe was also watching the door. At any moment, the door was going to swing open, revealing what? Jill heard singing coming from the other side of the door. It sounded like two young girls singing. Her boyfriend could hear them as well. They couldn't make out the words to the song, but it definitely was young kids singing. Jill listened to the nursery rhyme and was able to make out only the very last word, dancing. The song was accompanying the sound of the knob turning back and forth, like it was keeping the tempo. The voices had a teasing quality to them, like the little girls were making fun of someone. Jill and her boyfriend were frozen in place, being tormented by these otherworldly voices. The singing stopped, as did the doorknob turning. It was quiet as a tomb. As soon as the entities outside the door had left, Jill and her boyfriend found they could both move. The whole horrifying ordeal had lasted about 10 to 12 seconds. Not all that long, unless it's happening to you. Jill's boyfriend jumped out of bed and ran to the door. Opening it, he saw the next room was empty. He quickly searched the whole house, but he could find no one. Jill joined her boyfriend in searching the house. She discovered there seemed to be a trail of sorts running from the bedroom door, through the house and out the kitchen door. The trail felt like a hot tube of air, with an oily feel to it. She could feel it any time she stepped into it, and then she could feel it go away when she stepped out of the trail. They had 2 cats. Both cats were cowering in the corner of the room. All the doors were locked and the windows were secured. There was no way anyone living, could have gotten into the house. They sat down and compared notes. Jill and her boyfriend had both heard and experienced the exact same things. Animals can see things that we can't. Whatever had been at the door must have been visible to the cats. Joe checked his watch, and he saw it was time for him to get going to work. Jill didn't really want him to go. It would have been a little hard, no, it would have been real hard, to call in sick, saying that him and Jill had just been visited by 2 ghost kids that scared them both to a point that neither of them wanted to be alone. Well, Joe went to work. The whole time he was gone, Jill kept every light on in the house, as well as the TVs in the living room and bedroom. This was the only time anything like this has happened, but they both catch themselves wondering about each and every sound from the house around them. It's now time to give some business to some friends of mine. Don't forget to swing by Optica del Norte at 107 Calle del Norte and get your eyes checked. If you're having to hold things out at arm's length to see them, you're doing it wrong. The 1755 barbecue at the Frontera Beer Gardens is some of the best food in town. It's on San Bernardo. You can go by Tuesday through Saturday from 11 to 2 or from 6 to 11. I highly recommend the LPRS burger. If your skin looks like you've been not taking good care of it, maybe you ought to contact my wife, Lourdes James, and ask her about what you can do to your skin to keep it from looking like Lon Chaney. You can contact her at 956-723-3019. Take care of your skin. It's the biggest organ in your entire body. And if you hear a bump in the night and you think it might be either your cat knocking things over or maybe a dead relative come to visit, contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society. You can get a hold of them at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. There I've taken care of most of my friends, the ones that have businesses, and the ones that have asked me to help them out. In a time like this, it's a good idea to take care of your friends, your neighbors, your relatives. Shop in your neighborhood. Buy things from people you know. They need the business, and they need the money. The story I just mentioned a few seconds ago, it sounds a whole lot like something that happened to a friend of mine from the police department. He was trying to catch a few winks before going into work at midnight. He noticed there was a voice message on his phone, so he opened it to see who had contacted him. On the recording was the sound of kids laughing, but not in a nice way. It creeped him out so much he jumped up, got in his uniform, and went into work an hour early. Any of y'all that work shift work knows that going into work an hour early, well, that's just unheard of. I've heard from a few other people who have had weird experiences while at home in the middle of the day. Not all paranormal activity happens at night. Brings to mind a big question I have about the Bigfoot hunters. They always go into the woods at night, and they always say that Bigfoot is a nocturnal animal, or creature. Personally, I don't think it's an animal, but that's just my thought process. Why do they always go at night? Most credible sightings happen in the daytime. The Patterson-Gimlin film was filmed in the middle of the day. The Memorial Day video was shot in the middle of the afternoon. There have been hundreds of sightings in broad daylight, and yet the Bigfoot hunters will always go out at night. I used to suggest to the guys that instead of traipsing around in the woods dressed in camouflage, what they should do is mount a camera on the dash of their vehicle, one pointed forward and one pointed backwards, and just film the roads as they drive. What do I know? Of course, that's how most of the good footage is caught. Next story comes from Ainoflux072. Well, that name is just too much to say more than once, so I'm going to cut it down a bit. How about I just go with 72? 42 would have been better, but 72 it is. Some of y'all will get that reference. I believe 72 is a female based on the character I found on the internet. It's a manga, some kind of a cartoon character. If I'm wrong, well, I'm sorry about the images are all of a person with womanly-like body. If you're a guy and you have a female character as your avatar, well, okay, that's your business. Okay, 72. 72 used to live in an old apartment along with her dog, a 140-pound Great Dane. The dog would look down the hallway towards the bedroom from time to time and growl for no apparent reason. This seems to be common practice amongst dogs. Mine do it from time to time, and I always try to see what they're looking at. I have taken dozens of photos, but I have never caught anything. Occasionally, when 72 was sleeping with her dog across the foot of the bed, a 72 would wake up to find the dog staring at the door, sometimes growling at some unseen thing. Well, 72 just wrote this off as the dog having a bad dream or maybe an overly active imagination. One night, she woke up due to her dog barking. This sounded way more intense than the usual "there's a squirrel outside the window" bark. It was "there's something wrong" kind of bark, and the dog was barking at her. The 72 looked up and saw a bright image hovering in the air above her. The light was about 6 inches from her face. The shape was kind of human-like, but there were no distinguishable features. 72 said she got the distinct impression that this thing had been watching her while she slept, maybe for a long time. The light didn't give off any heat, and there was no feeling of meanness or kindness, just a weird light. The dog was still barking, as if it sensed something was not right. 72 twisted sideways and rolled out of bed to the opposite side, away from the light. Coming to her feet, she saw the light had gone. Shortly after this encounter, the 72 asked the building manager if anyone had died in the building. The manager said she'd look into it and get back to her. A couple of weeks later, the manager came back with a yes. A woman had died from a drug overdose in the apartment where 72 was now living. This had happened 12 years earlier, back in 1995. Her dog still growled at the hallway from time to time, but 72 said she's never seen that weird light since that one night. She moved out about a year later. According to those who look into such things, the very first female serial killer in the United States was Lavinia Fisher. It is believed Lavinia was born in 1793, but there's no record of where she was born or what her maiden name had been. Her records seem to start with her marriage to John Fisher in Charleston, South Carolina. The couple moved 6 miles out of Charleston and built an inn. This led to the place being called the 6-Mile Wayfarer House. They ran the inn and made a good living, a very good living. Their income was considered to be far more than could be explained by travelers who spent the night. On occasion, some travelers would disappear. This was the early 1800s, and folks did vanish from time to time. There were still bizarre accidents to blame or wild animals. Highwaymen were working the roads, and anyone could find themselves the victims of these lawless men. The first federal law enforcement agency was the United States Marshal Service, established in 1789. This was followed shortly by the U.S. Park Police in 1791 and the U.S. Mint Police in 1792. Local inhabitants had to rely on whomever was elected or local volunteers that would gather together and look for any criminals after something had happened. If someone was reported missing, the locals would form a search party to look for the victim. If they found a body, the locals would try to figure out who or what had killed them. If the cause of death wasn't obvious, the death would be ruled as unknown, and usually that was the end of that. It didn't take a rocket scientist to begin noticing that most of the missing travelers were vanishing from one particular area. Once the authorities began to dig, they found many of the missing had been seen in or near the 6-Mile Wayfarer House. Well, the investigators went by and they asked Lavinia and John about the missing men, and they were reassured that the men had left in good physical condition, and the couple had no idea where they might have gotten to. Lavinia was said to be a very beautiful and charming woman. She was able to convince the authorities she was telling the truth. At one time, people thought that criminals looked like they were guilty. There were books on how to recognize a criminal based on their appearance alone. Criminals were ugly and had a certain look to them. Good-looking people were all good people. The locals still had their suspicions, and soon they gathered up a group of vigilantes who went to the Fishers in February 1819 to look into their activities. The name vigilante has become a bad thing. Vigilante entered the English language in the 19th century. It was borrowed from the Spanish word of the same spelling, which meant watchman or guard. The Spanish word can be traced back to the Latin vigilare, meaning to keep awake. At one time, a vigilante was someone who was there to keep an eye on things, the area's guards. You've heard of a person being vigilant. Why is it if you're vigilant, it's okay, but if you're a vigilante, people think there's something wrong with you? English language, it's always changing. Once more, the folks trying to solve the matter of the missing travelers were convinced that John and Lavinia were just a pair of innkeepers. Somebody suggested keeping a watch on the inn all night long to see if maybe there was somebody lurking in the vicinity who was causing these travelers to vanish. One of the locals, David Ross, was to stay awake all night and watch the inn. At some time during the early morning hours, Ross was attacked by two men. They beat him and then drug him before John and Lavinia for questioning and probable execution. The night David Ross was abducted, a traveler had checked into the inn. John Peoples had been on the road, and he was looking for a place to stay the night. Lavinia rented John a room and then served him dinner. After dinner, Lavinia served him a cup of tea. A tea was considered to be too British by many of the folks living in the United States after the Revolution. Coffee was a patriotic drink, and only Tories drank tea. John dumped the tea out when Lavinia wasn't looking. What John didn't know was the tea was heavily laced with a drug that would have knocked him unconscious. Something wasn't right. John felt uneasy about how Lavinia had acted all the time he was around her. He was also worried about how her husband, John, had given him odd looks. Feeling uneasy about his stay, John didn't go to bed right away. He sat in a chair thinking. There was a loud crash as the bed vanished down a trap door. John realized this was an attempted robbery, so he grabbed his things and fled immediately, heading for the nearest town. When John was making his complaint against Lavinia and John, yes, there are two Johns in this story, Lavinia and her husband John, David Ross, who had managed to escape from his would-be killers. He ran to the nearest town where he encountered John Peoples. Between the two of them, they filled in the authorities on what was really going on at the 6-Mile Wayfarer house. Police then arrested John and Lavinia Fisher, as well as two other men that they had been operating with. These were the two men who had attacked David Ross. The 6-Mile Wayfarer house was thoroughly searched and the grounds were dug up. The building had passageways running under it, each one leading to one of the guest rooms. The sheriff found many items that could be traced to dozens of travelers that had been reported missing over the years. In the kitchen, they found substances that were used to put people into a deep sleep. As the investigation continued, the remains of as many as 100 bodies were found. The bones were jumbled together, and some were in such bad state they could only guess at whether it was one person or several. John and Lavinia were locked up, but the two men working for them were allowed out on bail. I would guess the two hunchmen were cooperating with the authorities so they didn't wind up the guests of honor at a necktie party. The two murderers knew their days were numbered, so they got busy trying to escape. They'd managed to make a rope to rappel down the side of the jail, but the rope broke. After the escape attempt, the two were kept under guard until their trial. Both were found guilty and sentenced to hang. John talked to a priest and he begged for forgiveness, but Lavinia wanted to blame others for what they had done. It was all those society folk who were trying to railroad her, she said. It was someone else who did the crimes, and she was simply the scapegoat. February 18, 1820, the couple were taken from their cell and led to the gallows. John went along quietly, and he didn't make a fuss. But Lavinia, for unknown reasons, put on her wedding gown, and she refused to walk to the gallows. The deputies had to carry her. She ranted and raged about her innocence. She screamed and babbled. When the rope was placed over her head, she yelled, "If you have any words for the devil, give them to me and I'll deliver them." She then jumped off the edge of the platform and died with a horrendous, hideous look on her face. Many people believe John and Lavinia were buried in the Unitarian Church graveyard located between King and Archdale Streets in Charleston. Anyone executed by the authorities would be turned over to their relatives after their demise. John and Lavinia had thousands of dollars, but everything they had was tied to their dastardly deeds. No one came forward to claim the bodies, say they were more than likely buried in the Potter's Field Cemetery next to the jail. A potter's field, or a pauper's grave, or common grave, is a place for burial of unknown, unclaimed, or indigent people. Potter's Field is a biblical origin referring to Akeldama, stated to have been purchased with the coins that had been paid to Judas Iscariot for his identification of Jesus after Judas's suicide by the high priests of Jerusalem. The priests are stated to have acquired it for the burial of strangers, criminals, and the poor. The coins paid to Judas were considered to be blood money, and therefore nobody wanted to hang on to them, so they were used to purchase this field. Prior to Akeldama's use as a burial ground, it had been a site where potters collected high-quality, deeply red clay for the production of ceramics, thus the name Potter's Field. Immediately after their execution, people began to report seeing Lavinia looking out the window of her jail cell. The look on her face was the one everyone had seen immediately after she had jumped from the scaffold. After the great earthquake of 1886, people began to report her wandering around other parts of the neighborhood. Sometimes she was seen walking through the Unitarian cemetery just a few blocks away. This may have been why people began to believe that's where her and her husband had been buried. The report of her wearing her wedding gown might not be all that odd. Women didn't wear white for the weddings until 1840, when Queen Victoria wore a white wedding gown. So any kind of a fancy dress may have served as Lavinia's wedding gown. It could have been any color, and it didn't necessarily have to be a long, flowing gown. It could have been just a fancy dress. Seeing a ghost in a white gown might make some people think it's a wedding gown, when it's actually just a white gown or a dress. People have reported seeing Lavinia walking the streets of Charleston, South Carolina. When an evil person dies, do they all of a sudden become a nice ghost? I think her nastiness would continue even after death. Maybe this is her punishment for killing so many people. These next few stories are from my book, Paranormal Laredo. I interviewed the witnesses, and I am impressed by their encounters. A ghost of a little girl has been seen all over Laredo, from the library on McPherson to the Laredo College out at Old Fort McIntosh. The sports arena on Loop 20 and Mall del Norte have had a few reports of the ghost girl as well. In 1981, Laura lived close to the Laredo College on Santa Rita Street. At the time, it was called the Laredo Junior College. Her and her family lived in a small wood-framed home near the tracks that came from Mexico and ran north to San Antonio. Trains would go by when they're hooking up, and it is a rule that they blow their horn as they approach any and all intersections. This is not a quiet place to try getting any sleep, since trains would hook up and head north at all hours of the day and at night. Laura shared a room with her older sister. They were both asleep late one night when they heard the sound of someone tapping on the window. Being young kids, 6 and 9, they both looked out and saw a young girl and a boy standing right at the glass. The girl had on a white nightgown with a brown coat on top of it. She had reddish-brown hair. The boy was wearing knee pants with a barn jacket. The young girl looked to be about 6 or 8 years old, and the boy was a little bit younger. As they stood there, right outside the window, they were holding hands with each other. The girl asked them to come outside to play. Laura and her sister were tempted, but their father had told them that they had to stay in the house after dark, so they said they couldn't come outside. The girl in white kept asking and motioning for the two to join them outside the house. After a bit, the two outside went away, only to return a few nights later, knock at the window, and invite Laura and her sister to come out and play. After each late-night visit, Laura noticed her cat would be missing. She had to search for him and find him cowering under the bed or in a cabinet somewhere. It took a lot of persuasion to get him to come out. Any time the little girl and her brother came, the cat would hide. After this had gone on for a few weeks, Laura mentioned the late-night visits to her dad. He thought Laura was just imagining things. He said there's no way anyone could knock on the window because it's 5 feet up off the ground. The glass would have been out of reach for any small kids. Soon after the family moved away to the north side of town, the girl in white and her brother no longer came to visit. The house, along with all of its neighbors, were torn down, and a warehouse was built on that block. Friday, August 2018, Alex had just gotten hired to work at the Laredo Public Library on McPherson. He was watching as everybody left for the day, and he noticed a woman with 3 kids walk into the ladies' room. One of the girls was very well dressed, as if she were on her way to church. Young girls do like to dress up sometimes. Shortly, the woman came walking out the door, followed by 2 kids. Alex watched the door, waiting for the third girl to come out and join her family. The woman left the building as if not knowing or caring, as she was short one of her kids. Alex asked one of the maintenance personnel and the security guard to go see what had happened to the little girl. They went into the bathroom and then came out. There's no one in there. Alex knew he'd seen the woman and 3 kids go in, and only 2 kids come out. They all just kind of laughed about it, saying it must have been a ghost. This is not something covered in the employees' training. Though not technically in Laredo, the Columbia Bridge is considered Laredo territory. There isn't any town nearby. The only people living out there are ranchers and their workers. If you work at the Columbia Bridge, you live in Laredo. 2008 or 2009, a customs agent was working the bridge. He spotted a man walking across the bridge from the Mexican side. Foot traffic is not allowed on this bridge, only vehicles. Wondering what this guy was doing, the agent walked towards him to ask if just maybe there was some kind of a problem. Maybe he'd broken down and needed a wrecker. Just maybe there was some kind of a medical emergency. As the agent grew closer to the walker, he noticed the guy was covered in mud. He looked like he'd been rolling around in a mess. The walker began to open his coat. It was full length and it hung down to his feet. As the coat opened, the man stopped walking and then leaped up into the air. He flew away into the night. The agent was so shocked by his encounter, he was forced to seek professional help to try and understand what he'd witnessed on the bridge, or at least to drive the images from his mind. There isn't a lot for young kids to do here in Laredo. No amusement parks or attractions. Sometimes kids will find things to do on their own. Out to the east of town, at the end of Del Mar Boulevard, is San Ignacio Road. At one time, San Ignacio Road ran out to a group of live fire ranges used by the Army during World War II. You can still find plenty of used bullets laying on the ground in the impact area. I'm talking thousands and thousands of spent .50 caliber and .38 caliber bullets. After World War II, the land was turned over to the Air Force to be used as a radar base. When the radar base closed and moved to Oilton, the land was then turned over to the county and turned into a detention center. The folks there were mostly serving light sentences, less than a year. Webb County signed a contract with the Texas Department of Corrections to house some folks who had more time to serve. And some of these guys were a bit more violent. Late one night, the wrong thing was said to the wrong person. A small riot broke out, which turned into a big riot. The inmates began burning parts of the detention center down. Anything made of wood became ashes. The sheriff called in all of his deputies. This was followed by a request for the Border Patrol Special Response Team. Laredo Police Department was asked to help out, along with the Department of Public Safety. Texas Department of Corrections showed up and managed their prisoners. The area around the detention center was a mix of green, brown, blue, and gray uniforms. It took 2 days to get things under control, and TDC brought in buses to haul away their prisoners. The county took their prisoners to the downtown jail. The detention center was too badly damaged to be repaired, so it was abandoned. Kids began telling stories about the abandoned facility having been in an insane asylum, or there had been murderers locked up out there. Others said the place was filled with black magic practitioners. This led to groups of curious sneaking out to have a look. Carl and a few friends drove out to the gate that led into the facility. There was a locked gate about a half a mile from the detention center that had to be jumped. The road-in was in bad shape back during the riots, and it hadn't been worked on since. Trees hung over the pavement, and the fence was falling down everywhere. The road in ran past the facility and wound around at the north end, where it ended in a huge gate. The gate area was covered by a roof, so as officers and agents were coming in, they had some place to keep the sun off during the day. Any and all sidearms had to be placed in lock boxes at the gate area. The next gate was only opened once the first one was closed and locked. Once the complex was shut down, the gates had been left open. Inside the fence, the facility consisted of 9 cement block buildings for the prisoner housing, administration, and recreation. The kids broke up into a couple of groups and began roaming about the buildings looking for anything of interest. When Webb County closed the facility, they left behind most of the equipment and supplies. There were bunks and tables and chairs in the cell blocks. The beds had moldy sheets and pillows which had managed to somehow endure for years of neglect. Books and papers were strewn about the ground, along with prisoners' uniforms and shoes. Carl was with a goth girl who seemed very interested in this empty jail. As they were walking around near the main entrance, something big jumped off the roof over the gates. It startled them, but it wasn't enough to scare them off. They wandered about, finding themselves in the chow hall. The tables and benches were still there, along with trays and plastic spoons. As Carl was looking about the desolation, a plastic tray came flying from one side of the room, hitting him in the face. He was nearly knocked from his feet. There was no one in the building other than him and his female companion. Carl decided it was time to find the others and get out of there. They moved quickly through the open areas, and they managed to find the rest of the group, all in one of the supply buildings. In the center of the floor, clothes and bedding had been piled up. As Carl was telling his friends about the flying tray, something moved under the clothing. Old uniforms and sheets began falling away from some unknown being rising up from the middle of the pile. The whole gang turned and ran for the gate. As Carl was running, he glanced back to see if anything was chasing them. He saw what looked like a witch, all in black, coming behind them. He yelled to the others to run faster, and they all bolted through the gates and ran for the pickup. They sped away, looking back to see if the thing was still following. No, there was nothing on the road behind them. Today, there's a gate at the beginning of San Ignacio Road, so it's a 3-mile walk before you get to the gate to the detention center, and then another half-mile after that. It's not worth going out there. If you don't have permission, don't go. If you'd like to read more stories from Laredo, check out the book Paranormal Laredo. You can find it at the Organic Man Coffee Trike on McPherson or the Phoenix Bookstore on Victoria. It's also available from Amazon.com. If you're going to go looking for ghosts this month, do not trespass. If you get caught, you could wind up in jail or worse. If you have any good stories, something you'd like to share with the audience, send me an email. You can contact me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Let me know if there's something you'd like to hear on the show. If you're new to the show and you want to hear some of the archives from years ago, you'll have to go to YouTube. But when you look for my show, you have to type in the whole name, Strange Things with Chris James. There's about 12 other podcasters all going by the name Strange Things. I had the name first. I had it 2 months before that TV show came out. Anyway, till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things. Happy Halloween, y'all.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man the same murder three? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?